Okay.
Yeah.
I think that's okay. So Adam joined SparkGeo as a senior front-end developer in 2022, and he previously worked at the BBC on user identity management for the iPlayer, something that I'm sure most of us have interacted with. He now works on cool geospatial things and is going to talk about SparkGeo's reusable geospatial UI component library built for React. So I have to start making up facts again.
Yeah. What's your favorite color? Do you want to? Is that all?
That's all.
Testing. Hello, can you hear me? Excellent. Hello?
Yeah.
Better. It's not now. Does this work? It's the click level. It did before. No, it's done a weird thing, doesn't it? So. Why is this not working anymore? There we go. Yeah. Yeah, arrow keys will work. Cool. Yeah. So I'm Adam Tweedie, senior software engineer at the SparkGeo UK. And I'm just going to quickly talk about a project we started to do with React's component library for geospatial UIs, so to speak. Joe on that list is someone else who's also helping on this project. He's one of our Canadian colleagues, and he's also done a similar talk at FOSS4G in America. So a bit of background for SparkGeo, for those that don't know. We are a strategic geospatial advice and consulting company. We provide a lot of different services like geospatial analysis and data acquisition. But one of the big things we do is a lot of bespoke code to merge solutions to find things. Our CEO likes to use the term, we are a glue company. So we take different tech stacks or old legacy systems and we attempt to like cloudify them or build this bespoke solution for those use cases. So yeah, we solve problems using much different tech stacks, and we're big proponents of open source software. Yes, so about the context for the project is you may be familiar. So a quick question, how many people in here are developers? Okay, very good mix. How many of you have worked on front ends for geospatial applications? Okay, how many people have used a front end geospatial application? Okay. Good to know. So one of the things is UIs, geospatial UIs, for the most part, are very common. They have a lot of commonality, very similar components. And we'll go through a few examples. For example, yeah, so the previous one, you saw the layout, the standard layout with the sidebar, the map, the slipping map, so forth. Or there's other components that you've seen up here. You got your toggles and your layer cards, or your drop downs, search through stack collections, that sort of stuff. Yeah, again, common page layouts. Another common component you'll quite see, date range pickers, to move through time series data, maps, of course. And these came from the Map UI Patterns book, which are quite nice. So a few examples of some of the previous pieces of work that SparkGeo have done. You might be able to see some of these commonalities. So this is Mermaid. I believe it's like an ocean health data set tracker. And again, going back to that whole idea, lots of commonalities with the sidebar, statistics, popovers, two sidebars, and sleeping map. Moving on, this is one of the things I worked on when I first started working at SparkGeo. Proof of concept for working with Atlas Data Manager from Mapbox. Again, sidebar, layers, very quick, rough throw together, very similar standard layout. Prescient Earth, once again, you might be starting to see a theme. On the right-hand side, this one's slightly different. We have some it's pulling items from Stack and then displaying them in a nice little card with some metadata. And that might also look familiar for those who have used Stack browsing. Again, lots of things that are common componentized. So a brief overview for those who aren't in know. We worked mostly in React for our front ends, our UIs, which has this sort of pattern of using components with reusable snippets of code, and you can break those down to different elements on the page should you wish. There are lots of component libraries out there, and the idea of a component library is it's a collection of those code snippets that you can just reuse. And there's some examples, Chakra and stuff. MUI is a big one people we work with. Bootstrap has one now. Yes, this is just an example of Material UI, and an example of some of the components that they provide. So you might be familiar with. So you've got your toggles, your switches, your date ranges, that sort of stuff. I think that's just a further example of Material. That might be one of the ones. That's Monday. That's by monday.com. So yeah, the strategy for behind the idea behind we wanted to do this is we wanted to create something that's open source, and it needs to be valuable to us. So we didn't want to just recreate one of those other component libraries, something we've already got, toggles and switches, which moves us on to, and we also wanted it to be map library agnostic. So we don't want to build something that is purely for openness or purely for this. We want it to be unopinionated, useful, reusable components. So this brings us to the approach. And the idea is currently what we're focusing on is the idea of these core components, composite components, utility functions. And so what we feel will bring us the most value is how we've got this. We're focusing on the composite side of things and the utility functions. The core components, as said, there are so many other component libraries that provide that. So we don't really want to have to reinvent a switch or a toggle. The idea is we'll be building these composite components that take a lot of those core components along with a utility function to meet a specific geospatial need. So an example of a composite component from the Global Fishing Watch would be their layer card. And you've got all these other little smaller core components that build that up. Another good example, I think, on the next slide, yes, is something that else is being worked on is, for example, a collection selector from Stack. So the drop-downs are standard components readily available. However, being able to provide a utility function that then builds this drop-down and populates this drop-down list from a Stack collection is something that doesn't really readily exist. And we find we have to reinvent it every time we want to build something. So a bit further on our approach. So what we're going to go for, what we're currently aiming to do is use React Aria as our basis for our core components. The reason we chose React Aria, it's got a good backing, but it is unopinionated in a lot of things. It just gives unstyled base components with a focus on accessibility first. So it's not getting in the way in terms of styling or opinionation, but it's giving us all that accessibility built in at once. Yep, and that's just an example of some of the components that React Aria provides. Moving on from that, we are working in Storybook. So how many people are familiar with Storybook? Okay, so for a quick brief overview, Storybook is a nice tool that allows you to build these component libraries. What it enables you to do is, I'll show an example shortly. It provides like a nice little framework to load and look at a component in isolation without having to put it into a code or a project. And it's used widely by many big companies to build these component libraries. It allows you to test them in isolation and see them live. An example of our Storybook. So down the side, you can see all of our components that we've built so far. We have some layouts, we have our date range slider, and this is an example of the date range slider that my colleague, John, built. That just allows us to interact and see that component as we're developing. You can also make these storybook instances publicly available, so other people can see and use and interact, see what the API of each component is. Yeah, so challenges. So the idea behind this, creating an open source, creating a library itself is difficult, because within a company internally, you have lots of different developers from different backgrounds who like different things. So there are a lot of challenges that overcome. On top of that, we intend it to be open source. And as James mentioned earlier in his talk, there are a lot of challenges that come with making an open source library and managing that. We're not at that point yet. James had a list with all the things that you should do, and we don't have any of that. But that's because we're still very early. We're still trying to figure things out. As I said before, we're starting to touch on more sort of complex components, and trying to make them agnostic and unopinionated is challenging at times. Yeah, and that's pretty much it, I believe. Yes, just going further into there, publishing, versioning, all those other sort of things you come with running and managing an open source package, are things that we need to start considering to tackle. So this is a quick sneak peek example of one of the projects we are currently working on that is using the component library. So that is entirely built. That actual project itself has very minimal UI code. It just gets to focus on the logic business side of it. So what's next? Yeah, as I said, we're hoping to make the repo public at some point in the future. We still need to work on some of those challenges in terms of versioning of VM packages. And we are considering the idea of an extension to it would be map library specific modules. Do we want to tie it into a map library? Do you want to provide adapters, as some other people have done? And that's pretty much it, I believe. Okay. Any questions?
Let's leave that.
Chris?
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Adam. That was really good. Are there any questions for Adam?
Yeah. Hi, Adam. Wondering how much effort to make the system much lighter. Big deal.
So it's a good question. As I said, like early on, some of this simpler components, there isn't much challenge to make them agnostic rather than being some of the more complex components that we're starting to come across and looking now. That's when the challenge to be there's a constant battle. It'd be nice if we could do this, but then it'd be opinionated, and we're trying to avoid that. But one of the benefits of these component libraries, going back to does it provide value, is it can change. If the community or elders feel that it should do that, then that might be something we do.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? Yes.
Yeah, when you say like unopinionated, although it's not clearly opinionated to React, how do you work with adapters like, as we've seen before, there's different interfaces, map interfaces, whether it's open layers or MapLib, where you have the definition of a layer and you say you have an interface, a layer interface, a layer card, but what adapters do you build that?
Yeah, so the idea of the concept we're going with so far is all of these components, they might have their own internal state, but they don't tie into any other state. They are just, you put them on the page, but they provide an API that gives you effectively the ability to pass callbacks in or get information out of them. So you can write things event-based, as it were. So those toggles, you pass a callback function in, and that's how you can tie it in with your own state system for your maps.
Cool. Any other questions? Yes, from here.
Thank you. You mentioned the challenge of getting getting it to be adopted for internal use. But I suggest that once you're delivering some value, when an internal project needs to use it, you invite them to use your components, but also to sponsor something else off your to-do list, given they've made a saving from adopting it, and they should become self-fulfilling.
That's exactly the approach we're taking. So we've got another project coming up that needs a lot of those stacked components. They're not in there at the moment, but they're going to start adding them, which is going to be good because we are going to need those stacked components in another project down the line. And that's hopefully it will build its own value.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Adam. That was really interesting.